Hello, everybody. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. I'm gonna give it a minute to make sure everybody is where they want to be in this breakout rooms. And just really quickly, I want to point you to the chat in which you can actually see the link to the Jam boards if you want to start putting ideas down. Right. So let's go ahead and get started. I am Dr. Sandy Corbin. I'll be your facilitator for today. I'm a new transplant from Oakland, California, and a new faculty member at Portland State University in Urban Studies and Planning. And my work looks at the relationship between cities and nature at the intersection of race, class, and access to public park space. I want to start with a few words. It's a fundamental US right to assemble in public spaces, our civic commons. It's in demonstrations and protests, we often hear the chant, "Whose streets?" with the response, "Our streets" following. And so as we reimagine the civic commons, we must also think about access and how our communities can benefit from these shared spaces. In this breakout room, as was discussed before, we will be discussing about how to adapt streets to be more than just paid restaurant seating, and how we can promote stronger community ties and social connections through design, programming, and use of our public spaces. And with that, I encourage everybody to dream big, and let's worry about the designers figuring out how to change it from fiction to reality. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Please feel free if you want to unmute and start the conversation.
Sorry, could we get the link to the chat, the link in the chat again? I just joined and can't get it.
Okay, let's see if we can get, here is the link. If you scroll all the way up to the chat, unless you just came in, that's where it should be.
Thank you, Dr. Corbin.
Yeah. Great. So it should be there. The Jamboard is live. Feel free to add to that.
So Dr. Corbin, you asked for a place to start, and I think one place to start is that for 100 years, streets really have been given 90-something% to motorized vehicles, and we're at an extraordinary position now where we are able to redefine how we use those streets, not just a street here and there, which is what we've done so far experimentally, but to look at something universal. How do we change the balance, the uses of the street so that it becomes truly a public realm?
Exactly. So our streets can be a patchwork of gardens, canvases for artists, stages for cultures to express music, dance, poetry. It can be gathering spaces for play, whether we're thinking about checkers or chess. And it can be relaxing spaces, which I very much like the idea of places that you can actually go to meet your neighbors and build community. So there's a lot of opportunities out there. But a lot of times, let's get through the barrier of what can't be and really just dream up what we actually want to do in these spaces and think through that.
I would like to see, oh, sorry, someone. I would just like to see a lot of greenery, like, you know, there's Friends of Trees. I think that could be an involvement. I've seen where they have, I currently live in Springfield right now, but I plan to move back to Portland. But I see where they're kind of like boxing off stuff, and it starts to feel like they're putting up fences, and, you know, like it feels that way, you know, it's like, that's a public sidewalk. I should be able to see everybody's heads. You know, I don't feel like it's fair if they're starting to put up like these panels and stuff. I think that's uncomfortable and not fair. And it's starting to feel more like fences. So I think having some understanding too of like, hey, that's still a public place. Like you don't own the sidewalk. And putting up trees and things like that, just kind of like ripping out the old asphalt, all the old cement, you know, getting rid of the streets to some extent, at least, you know, because it's good to have like big walking paths, but I do think it's important to have like central trees down the maybe down the road and things like that. So I'd love to see that happen.
It sounds like moving from trees to maybe linear parks as a possibility. So I'm looking at the hands in the chat, and it looks like Kate Brooks.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great segue into my idea. I'm Kate Brooks. I'm an urban designer with CGF. I see my fellow colleagues, Brian and Patty on. Hello. Of course, we all chose this group, right? I wanted to say that when the Green Loop, if you are all familiar with the Green Loop, when that RFP came out for that to promote ideas for what it could be, I was in a group and I strongly felt like it wasn't a big enough idea. And no offense to the people who created it, I think it's a great start, but it needs to be more than a loop around Portland. And one of my thoughts was, what if it could be sort of a gateway into a series of zones that are car free? And it's more of a green, you know, network or a green radial pattern of pedestrian only zones. And unfortunately, we didn't submit that idea. But when I saw that car free zone diagram on the screen, I was like, oh my God, this is it. We have to do this. So I would love to think about a system in Portland, which is linked to the Green Loop, or just a far broader idea that does that sort of big picture thinking. And it would be, you know, Brian, you have some thoughts.
Well,
it would be, you know, pedestrians, bikes, maybe only electric cars. You know, people have to still access businesses. That's a thing.
I'm electronically challenged and I don't know how to do the digital hand, but
also look for actual hands too.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So I was in, this is kind of related to what Kate is saying. I've been intrigued for a number of years. The big European cities have created these kind of traffic restricted zones like central London, I think Amsterdam, other places, and they've done it through congestion pricing, where if you want to drive through that area, it's going to cost you dearly. And it changes by time of day. And Patty's very, very familiar with the London program, but it strikes me that we've talked about this idea. I've heard it talked about in PBOT for years, but maybe we're on the cusp now with the pandemic to really be bold and think about, you know, the use of gating devices or traffic diversion devices that could vary by time of day. So maybe when traffic needs to get through, maybe in the morning or the evening, they can get through, but the rest of the day, these become really pleasant. We have a much bigger, robust network of street public space that's car free, just like Joanne Hardesty mentioned. And, you know, they've been doing this in Europe for decades. And it strikes me that maybe Portland's time has finally come to think that way.
Sounds good. It looks like Laurel would like to jump in.
Yeah, I was thinking about most recently when we had this, you know, snow and ice storm, and I've had one back in 2016 and 2017. Obviously, like the first half of a snowstorm in Portland is always fun for people who are housed, and obviously people who are without housing, it can be a huge safety risk for them. But what I was thinking of is part of the reason that I think snow in Portland is so wonderful is that like nobody drives, because people leave their cars at home and go out into the neighborhood on foot or on cross-country skis and with their kids and their dogs and their neighbors, and activate, you know, that somehow really activates the streets for community members. And that's something that makes like neighborhoods really wonderful. And yeah, I was just thinking about that as like I'm not sure how we then model something like that to activate streets that are also carless on a more regular schedule without, the ensuing ice and powerlessness and all those negative effects. That was just what I was thinking.
Wonderful. It looks like David.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really
go for it.
inspired by the possibilities, I guess, watching this. But one thing I wondered, looking at other countries that have more publicly usable space in that sense, that a lot of them are in places where, they're fronted by businesses or churches or some kind of sort of public facing environment in a way. And I wonder whether there's like a challenge that I see, or kind of a chicken and egg problem in Portland, is the locations. I feel like what they were doing on Northeast Sumner really made a lot of sense, but where you have, either like residential streets where using later in the evening is going to at least cause political problems with the neighbors, or you have a lot of business streets that have kind of blank, walls of the back of a bank or whatever. Like how do we, I don't know, I'm wondering how we sort of manage that where we don't have the like public facing streets because they've just been used for cars, but how do we make the streets welcoming to non-car use when there isn't that like flow with the surroundings?
Absolutely. And I want to also be cognizant of time. So we're going to probably start shutting down, which I hate to say, the daydreaming in a minute or two, and then go with the reality check, which I don't think any of us want to do, but looking at what are the biggest barriers to achieving success and why haven't we done this already? But let's dream a little bit more. And I also want to bring in a question or a couple of thoughts, especially when we start thinking about how these spaces could be and how they could be used, and thinking about Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian communities, and what does that aesthetic look like within these spaces, and how can those uses also be intertwined into these new understandings of what these street spaces could do. So how do we make sure it's actually, public and welcoming, in which people feel belonged and they can also love it in these multiple ways? So kind of bringing that idea of a multi-cultural zone, and like maybe spreading it throughout the tapestry of what these streets could be in different neighborhoods. That's a thought I want to put out there from a comment from the chat. And it looks like I have Ted has his hand up.
Hi there, Ted Labby with the Urban Green Space Institute, and I'm also on the board and an activist with the Portland-based nonprofit DPAVE. I was the one putting comments in there about more green space. But to your point, CNE, Professor Corbin, one of the things we've done a lot in terms of trying to create welcoming spaces, and we haven't done this with streets yet, but kind of creating like gathering places. So less is being like places where, like if you're looking at a spot, create a destination, a place where people can hang out. So it's not just like a space for like lycra clad wealthy cyclists to zoom through, but it actually slows traffic down and maybe incorporates art that includes, kind of a multicultural perspective to make it like more welcoming. And we've done that a lot with some of our past projects, which are outside of right-of-ways. But in terms of like, there were questions about what nonprofits are working in this space. DPAVE has a project going, if some of you folks may know this intersection on Lower Sandy, Southeast Sandy and Stark. It's like a 5-way intersection and it's really ugly. We're working with this fellow, Adam Zucker, who's an engineer, to close off 7th there, which is a strange street that doesn't go anywhere. And this is like a couple blocks off the Green Loop, to actually create kind of a destination space there. So take back the street, which has no green space whatsoever, and do a giant rain garden and tree wells and like an outdoor kind of destination place for people. So we're looking at how we can, bring art into the public right of way. And we're using money from the Bureau of Environmental Services. So again, trying to cross-pollinate with the utilities a little bit, which I know doesn't happen too often in Portland, or often enough, in my opinion. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Make sure we get this information on the Jamboard if you're not getting it in.
Yeah. We don't have a website yet for this project, but we will be in touch with it shortly. And you can check out our website, dpave.org, if you want to see what we do. But this is the first project we've ever done in a right-of-way. So results to be determined.
Yeah, do us a solid and put the address in the chat so everybody has access to that. And Guinevere Shaw, you're up next.
Cool. I'm actually oddly gonna hopefully be working on that seventh Insanity project, coming in as a sub-consultant to DPAVE. So looking forward to helping with that piece. And was glad you brought that up, because I think that's a key thing. I think something, maybe this transitions into some of the reality check pieces of it, is what do these things look like in a residential neighborhood when there may not be, businesses or the institutions. We mentioned the churches earlier, kind of rec centers. Those are great, places to focus on around, but then just what if you just want to do this on a residential street? How do you make sure that the folks that live on that street aren't the ones that feel like they get to be the primary users of it? If you stick to that kind of smaller scale 1 to 2 block iterations, there are people that live there and there are people that not, and you want to make sure it gets open to everyone. And really, working with the communities to identify what they want to see, like what people want to see and do. I think that those are all, that residential piece, when there are no businesses, especially when you look at how districts or business districts, and especially those that are institutionalized in any, even if it's relatively informal, but as an organized group, if those don't exist in parts of the city, which we all acknowledge is fact, then how do those groups still, or those areas still get these types of things? So those are just some of my thoughts.
I think those are excellent points, because I think one thing is, how do you even reimagine what a community center is using this, right? And what are those spaces that those communities need to maybe, do something like picnics or swap meets and things like that? Like, how do we reimagine that? So thank you so much for that. And it looks like Leah Suihang.
Hi, Layla.
Hi, Layla, sorry.
That's okay. I am also reasonably new faculty at PSU, hired to do urban design within the architecture department, but with a background in urban and environmental history. So I guess for me, in transitioning from like big dreaming to realities, it seems to me that the existing structures is kind of, okay, the ownership of the street is dedicated to transport. It's PBOT, who have been in the business, as Patty mentioned, for the last 90 years or so, of using street space to transport things from one place to another. And now we're talking about trying to turn those spaces of flow into permanent, of like places or hubs. And business is the kind of permitting, is the infrastructure for how we are doing that. And I guess the question for me is, how do you transition from those institutional frameworks as something that is designed for a whole other purpose, like how that happens within planning. And I guess I would ask you, Dr. Corbin, in terms of, I think you call this the civic commons. And I think commons is an interesting way, like, to think about a street as a commons. And I just wanted to hear maybe your thoughts. I suspect you have an idea about this yourself.
Whenever I think about commons, I go all the way back to the Enclosure Acts, right? So the commons definitely have to be, right? So it had, the feudal system. So we always have to protect it, right? Because privatization is always possible. And so when we do think about the commons, I think one thing that, if we think about it in the traditional sense, is that everybody had ownership of it, right? And then there were very specific understandings on what resources you were able to benefit from and tap into. And so when we think about the civic commons and looking at this through public spaces, where do communities tap into the resources to possibly actually create these spaces themselves, maybe outside of the city or alongside the city in different ways? Like if they wanted picnic tables, like some folks were saying, who would they talk to? If they wanted to paint the streets for a particular festival, where would they go? What permissions would be needed? And really, how do you really center the commons around actually community engagement? Does that come with a technological fix through apps and calendaring? And who would be the one? So I'm thinking maybe a neighborhood group could be a sort of advisory committee or a group that can help facilitate this. But in all of those different ways, the question becomes, how do we ensure inclusion and we ensure access for all those who want to, use these spaces? So I think a lot of this remains to be seen. But I think one thing that unfortunately COVID is teaching us, there are many ways to find how to communicate with each other and collaborate with each other. And so it's how do we activate that social network to connect to that public infrastructure to create these changes that communities are going to need and want in their neighborhoods, and also businesses as well. So I think there's a lot to be said about it.
Yeah, and that's great. And I'm sure it must be very strange to be a sort of transportation agency that is now somehow in the business of thinking about public space and commons. It's going to be really nice to see how that transpires.
Well, the streets were originally commons, and I think Patty Tillett was coming with that, right? I think it took less than a decade for it go from people centered to car centered, and the turn of the phrase that getting hit by a car, and that there was a turn of a phrase back in the day that a car hit me, meaning putting the onus on the car for doing something wrong, versus getting hit by a car, meaning that you're in the wrong place and you shouldn't have been in the street in the first time. And it's less than a generation that what was considered to be a public space turned into car-focused infrastructure. But we also got the playground movement after that because we couldn't have kids in the streets anymore. So, and you get the public park system, the public park systems that we see today. But that's a lot of history wrapped up in a very, very short period of time. But I think it still speaks to this need for communal locations for people to do some deep hanging out. And I think as streets and as neighborhoods, and especially during gentrification, we need to find these places for people to meet each other. It's harder. We're not going to school anymore, right? Some of us are not going to school as far as elementary school, that this is my friend, I don't know you, you don't know me, let's be friends. We still need those spaces as adults. And unfortunately, within park systems, that onus tends to be focused generally on children, but we also need our adult spaces as well. So just something to think about. Did you want to jump in, Mike?
Yeah, do you mind? I love that, that story that you just shared, because I think it's, when I kind of approach this conversation, I always think about how quickly we've given up, or we gave up our public spaces to automobiles. And while that probably is like the biggest barrier in terms from like a physical design of getting it back, it's possible. Like there's plenty of cases where it's been done here, but also nationally, internationally, and all that. One thing that I'd love to kind of bring up and talk more about in this space is, like, I see a lot of comments about decommodifying these public spaces, or or risks around privatization, kind of defending the commons from one space. So a parking space that was privatized by the automobile storage that is being used for a restaurant isn't purely a public space, right? Correct. So thinking a lot about how to activate these for that kind of social connection, to build relationships with people in your community, to see each other in public, to acknowledge people, and then how does that get sustained, right? So one of the easiest ways that we were able to scale up this Healthy Businesses program is because, like, businesses were like, we'll activate it, we'll pay for it, just give us the space. But there's a bigger picture opportunity, right, around cultural spaces, around spaces for food security, around equity, about community building. And I'd love to hear from the group about ways in which we think like that could be kind of a more central focus of this work.
Thank you. And I just want to keep our eye on the time as well as we start looking at this, who and what is missing in the conversation. Thank you for bringing that along. And I believe Ann Nguyen has had their hand up for a while. So if you wanted to jump in, please do so.
Yeah, thank you. And Dr. Corbin, I really appreciated like your perspective on the public space and the civics common. And I wonder if it might be somewhat of a polemical stance that I think that our foundational problem to creating these public spaces is that we cannot create spaces that are inclusionary to everyone, especially if there's only one overseeing body, such as PBOD. So I think, Mike, also to tie it back to your point about the commodifying these spaces too, I think we can maybe like start incorporating voices from other groups and just like kind of empowering them and giving them the agency to create the spaces that best suit their needs. And it can work on like a neighborhood scale, or it can work in like a citywide, like a more citywide agencies, but like catering to a specific demographics. I think that could be a start, and also like decolonizing our urban planning practices, so that there isn't like just one central body trying to create space that cater to everyone, but like just empowering people to make the space that works best for them.
Excellent point. And I'm going to throw the mic over to Andrew Oliver.
Sorry, I've had my hand up for a while, and I really want to touch.
I think Kate was.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Okay.
That's okay.
Only because you talked before, I wanted to throw Andrew in there. But go ahead, Kate.
True.
Fine, go ahead. It's fine. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I just this is such great context, because as an urban designer, of course, this is what I do, is design space for people. And the public realm is what we work in. And so there's so many ways we can physically change spaces, whether it's tactile urbanism, like the examples you've seen of, adding tables and chairs in parking spots or adding planters. But there's also a major community engagement process to allow the spaces that are available to people to be useful to that group of people. And it depends on where you are. We're doing a huge community outreach process right now for the historic Albina community as it relates to the work being done near the Roost Quarter and I-5. This is a separate independent assessment based on the community's needs. And they're telling us what they need, and that's gonna shape the spaces. But I just want to add to the point of, what's the roadblock here? No pun intended, is that the bottom line is that PBOT and ODOT own this space. And also there's private ownership of spaces that could be, utilized for public space. That's the bottom line. So if we want to make these spaces available to the public and change them, it needs to be discussed with PBOT and ODOT. So that's kind of where we, as designers hit a wall.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, and I want to throw it over to Andrew. And at the same time, because it is a commons and people pay taxes, it's really our spaces as citizens and residents within the city as well. And so how do we rethink agency via agencies, not pun intended, for communities to actually create the spaces they need, want, and desire within the city. So I'm going to throw it over to Andrew, and our time is running out. I apologize.
Oh, so I could be quick. I was just thinking about Mike's point there. So I don't know. I feel like now we're disconnected chronologically in the conversation slightly. Sorry, but about who's about businesses and other organizations or whatever. I think just because I have like a long background in music, and it got me thinking about, I know this isn't like the art group, but I think me thinking about like the role of not only like visually, you know, but also like activities like music and how how that can be used to you know, to be a unifying factor, or at least a community building factor, and maybe people involved in that could get involved in. I've run out of time. Anyway, I just wanted to bring music into the equation.
Thank you so much. And please capture all your great ideas on the Jamboard. I believe it's going to be open for a little while. So put those ideas in there. And if you want to throw any links into the.
We're all coming back from our breakout rooms. I'm watching the numbers tick up as people rejoin our large group. So yes, welcome back from your breakout groups. I hope your discussion was engaging and informative. I hope you were able to share your questions or comments in the chat, in the discussion, in the Post-it note tool, because we want to be able to refer back to these notes and share what we've learned. So I want to just take a moment to kind of hear from our facilitators, just a sliver of what you discussed. I'm going to give each of our facilitators just a couple minutes to report back to the large group, to share kind of what the discussion explored, what you found most striking of the ideas, and you know, whatever you wanted to kind of bring back to the larger group in this wrap-up moment. So Julius, if you could start us out with a summary of what you all talked about in your group.
Yeah, there's a lot of really great discussions. I think something that that immediately stood out that I think sort of applied to all three aspects of what we're doing here. So the dream, but also addressed to the practicality and next steps, was mutual aid, which is something that is, you know, developed and that's kind of grown since the pandemic, and that also sort of intersects with this ability for us to, you know, meet people where they're at, right? There have been mutual aid networks that have expanded since the pandemic, and something that was discussed and brought up was, you know, we can piggyback off of what's already been there. Another thing that came up, and something that sort of just something I noticed, which tends to be like a problem like in Portland and in these spaces, was, you know, creating spaces that are actually inclusive to the conversation and allowing BIPOC folks to actually come to the table. So something that was said just at the very end was, you know, even the timing of this event is somewhat problematic because it falls smack dab in the middle of the workday. And, you know, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that here we are having a discussion about global equity, diversity, and inclusion, and the majority of the folks in the conversation are white, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But what came out of that conversation, again, as a result, were folks talking about how they can be more open. And while that's a conducive and productive conversation in its own right, it still misses the way in which we actively meet folks where they are. And so the last thing I'll say that I think came up, which kind of sums up some of the other things, so sorry folks who said great things and I'm not mentioning here, was, you know, finding tangible ways to deal with sort of the realities of the historical legacy of inequality in Portland, racial inequality in Portland. So, you know, finding ways to address where, like, what past wrongs, so not having green space, not having parks, and then also getting out of the way. So when folks do start to do new things, how we can help them by facilitating that further, but not being paternalistic in our approach, not thinking we know best. And when I'm saying we, it's those with wealth, power, money, right? Those who are here in this conversation, not the communities that we're actively attempting to support with that, right? And so that's things that came up for us. Thanks.
Thank you, Julius. Now we want to hear from Todd.
We had really good ideas come up and stayed a lot in the daydreaming but embedded in it were the reasons why a lot of these things, the challenges before them. So really wanting to, you know, I think a lot of the ideas were beginning with a premise of let's get quickly beyond businesses, right? It's not about healthy business permits, it's not privatization of public space, it's public space, and what does that mean? And in terms of shutting down streets for that use, thinking broader, engaging the community to do that, maybe thinking about road diets came up, as well as just thinking of partially shutting down streets and really being mindful about how that's done and thinking about that in inclusive ways. One thing that was great in our group is that we had people who were working with really specific ideas, really specific proposals that when you hear them, you think, yeah, absolutely, let's do that. But have found that, you know, some of the barriers that have come up seems to, you know, initially we heard things like a lack of consensus. Of course, money is always an issue, But as we're dreaming big, I think we already have a lot that we can leverage. We just heard from a couple ideas that are already happening, but we know that throughout the city, there are people with amazing ideas doing great proposals, and it's just a matter of bravely doing them.
Thank you, Todd. Professor Corbin, what did you have to share?
Oh, so I think one thing that we definitely wrestled with, especially under the idea of civic commons, is how even in the classical sense, if we think about the feudal system, that there's always a tug of war between public and privatization, and what does actually public mean, and how do communities have agency to actually change their streets to their desired needs. And so one of the topics that did come up is how are communities be able to have this agency and create their commons outside of business districts? Like, how does that look like at the neighborhood level? I think a lot of people are in support of a carless street system at some, in some degree, but we also have to understand that it is putting up barriers. And what does it mean when you shut down one part of the street, and what does that mean as far as access? I'm particularly thinking about frontline and essential workers, and how sometimes streets being shut down also means that they are having a longer, more laborious way of getting to their work. And I think that particularly targets Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian workers that tend to be the frontline workers under COVID. But I think one of the things is, and I think it was a really great point that was brought up, is that a lot of these tensions around how community wants get filtered through the municipality, through these agencies, and what does that mean to have that filter and not have direct agency, and what could that mean as far as technology, or there's a great post on like paid positions for common keepers, and like what would that mean, and how do we secure that that idea of the civic commons moving forward. So I think there's a lot of great conversations. I think people are very excited to see this, but I think there's also a little bit of how can we actually make this open for everybody, in which they can feel a belonging and feel dignity, and actually be full agents of these spaces that they seek in the city.
Thank you. Subhashini.
Thank you. We covered a lot of ground, I believe, and I'll start with, we had a series of questions that we started with, one of which was who's not here, who's not in this room, and I'd like to read a few of those thoughts. Frontline workers, families, Black Portlanders, children, political decision makers, houseless community, seniors, BIPOC, immigrants, refugees, people with disabilities, people representing Portland's many different neighborhoods, people without access to technology. So we kind of began with the privilege that we have to be in this room to have this discussion. And then we took it through those three questions with an added lens. So in question one, we added questions that related to what are words and phrases that you might use to describe creative placemaking. So we had many things like inclusiveness, welcoming, a place to be, a place to engage, making a place meaningful and inclusive so it speaks to the community that lives right there and to all others who arrive or visit, color and multisensory experiences, incorporating nature into city as a form of art, people being excited to be in that space. So I assume everyone's going to get to see Jamboards, because I'm just going to spend the next week, I think, just staring at them. And then the second question of the reality check, we added another lens of what does equity and accessibility mean to you? And several of the answers included fear of change. Biggest barrier is apathy and lack of understanding why all people need to be included in this planning process. Cultural engagement is key. Money, cost, ongoing stewardship, opportunities for everyone to be part of the creative process, subjective tastes and attitudes forced on public art. And then in the number 3, the next steps, we added another lens of how do we do creative placemaking in an equitable way. So bringing those 2 thoughts that we had at the beginning. And again, it relates to, I think, the question that we were thinking about at the beginning of who's not at the table. So empowering youth, break down disciplinary silos, make the process easy, don't get it too complicated. Landscape designers and architects encouraging artists, involving relevant groups. And there was a discussion about involving them at the get-go rather than plan and say, here, we're presenting this plan to you. What do you think about it? So I will leave it there. Really appreciate the community. We worked hard. I gave everybody a framework of, can we do this together in relationship and evolve rigorous creative activation? So thank you. Team.
Thank you, Suba. Hao, you want to close this out?
Yeah, sure. So we spent a lot of time daydreaming because funding and stewardship, I think, is a really difficult piece of the equation in making these public spaces work. And so in daydreaming, a lot of the ideas fell in the realm of, can we partner with other existing programs? So for example, is there a way that we can work with parks in order to develop more pocket parks and plazas and these green spaces that are focused within the neighborhood? You know, the idea of partnering with youth organization and libraries to adopt plazas and just make it a space that feels welcoming to those of all ages and different sized communities. There was this thought of, you know, the healthy business program is great, but how do you create a vision for everybody to be an initiator of these programs and not just businesses? Can somebody who is just, you know, in their neighborhood activate their space with whatever idea? And so in order to do that, it needs to be sort of right size so that any regular person can pick it up and start with varying levels of commitment. And then reality hit, and I felt like this is where we became sort of bureaucratic. And so the reality of the fact that, you know, you can spark an idea with passion, but soon burnout is pretty common even in the business. So, you know, for example, even if you have sort of an anchor tenant, what happens when they move on to the next thing and decide that they no longer want to be a part of that business? Also, there's this concern that what if the actual use of the space does that match the intended use? And so does there need to be clarity on what the intent of the space is? And then just maintenance dollars, where does it come from? You know, even if we do partner with parks or other public agencies, they are also tapped for resources. And so we are all fighting for sort of that, you know, we are working in that scarcity model. So how do we move beyond the scarcity model? But we did leave, we did have some ideas for next steps. So for example, Marnie Duke put out that the Metro RTO, the regional transportation options, they have some funding for light infrastructure. So if you have an idea, you can reach out to Marnie to seek out a grant for your idea. And then in the Brentwood neighborhood, there's a small group of folks who are called the Brentstock incubators. And so they, I think, are ready and passionate to take on neighborhood projects that improve the right-of-way spaces with urban habitat and green community spaces. So there are some small ideas that can ignite some of the some additional stewardship possibilities.
Thank
And
you,
I will
Hal.
leave it at that.
Thank you, Hal. Yeah, I know there's a lot to try to capture in a small report back. I just want to say thank you so much to all of our facilitators today. I was able to bounce around and listen into a few of the different breakout groups. I heard great conversation and comments and discussion in all of them. We're going to wrap up today's workshop with information for how to stay involved and what comes next. If you could load up the slides, Ellen, we can show people.
Yes, I shall.
One of the best ways for community to get involved in street transformation projects just over the last 10 years or so has been through a community group called Better Block PDX. Now they've got a new partnership with Portland State University, and Better Block PSU offers a pipeline to develop your own community-led ideas using student teams to develop the concepts, the engineering, to work through some of those details. They have an open request for project proposals that's active right now. And we want you to think about it. Think about submitting your own projects, connecting with your community and seeing if there's an idea you can submit to their response for proposals and get the process rolling. We'll post a link in the chat for you to follow up.
Well, some of you might be wondering, what are we going to do with all of this great stuff that we learned today? Well, for one thing, we're going to inform the work of projects that a bunch of students at PSU and the University of Oregon are going to be working on in collaboration with various community partners. And we would really love for other people who teach or who are doing research, whether it's at the college level or at high school level, if you think that there's an intersection between what you're working on and the themes that we've been addressing here, we'd love for you to engage with us and bring your classes in. We're going to be holding a workshop in April that'll be focused on these projects. We're just trying to get a date that works for all the different classes. So stay tuned for that. And this information hopefully will help, Hal and her colleagues develop some of these proposals they get for the Better Block projects. They're going to come in and they'll be, probably open for a lot of different suggestions. We certainly hope to inform PBOT's continuing experimentation in placemaking in public space. And I shouldn't limit that to PBOT, because I think one of the things that's come out of this is the need for, more coordination and collaboration between different agencies. And we will like to present it in a form that will be available for community members and practitioners, share it with people. And there will be a follow-up of after our April event, which is hopefully to generate brainstorming and build the collaborative process around these specific projects. We'll reconvene at the end of the spring, whether it's in late May or early June. We'll pin that date down and we'll share with everybody the findings of our various meetings, as well as discuss the work that's been done on the projects. And more, importantly, or equally importantly, talk about the next steps for the Urban Design Collaborative. And I've posted this link here, and it'll be posted in the chat. Until we get our website up, please get in touch with us through this feedback form. So again, as I said at the beginning, Urban Design Collaborative, we don't really exist yet. We are starting a conversation. This is the beginning. There were a lot of people who were not part of this conversation, who were not here today. What might we be? What might we do? Please join us. It's you don't have to be a designer to join this group. You just have to want to think creatively about the future of places, particularly important, but also beyond. And we're looking for your collective energy to help bring this group to life. So Nick did such a great job in moderating. I think we could bring it to an end here unless there are any final comments that Nick, you or Hal or any of our other facilitators would like to share as a way of thanking everybody and saying goodbye until next time.
I just want to say thank you to everyone for being such a great audience and our facilitators for helping make this happen. We couldn't have done it without everyone here to make this discussion happen. So thank you so much.
I also wanted to thank everybody, but I also think that we need, one of the next steps is to bring together the folks whose voices have not been heard. And so I think that is a specific next step that we will try to make happen.
But we can't do that alone. So we invite all of you to help us reach the people that need to be reached.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. Hope to see you in April.